Good afternoon, and welcome to this keynote lecture by Janaina Mourao-Miranda. Very pleased that you all came today, and please open the app in the section where you can ask questions. That's a great way to get your questions answered during the talk.
Yes, hi everyone. It is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon, Professor Janaina Mourao-Miranda, who is currently a professorial research associate at the Computer Science Department at UCL and at the Max Planck UCL Center for Computational Psychiatry and Aging Research. Her work focuses on developing and applying machine learning models to investigate complex relationships between neuroimaging data and multidimensional descriptions of mental health disorders. And without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to you. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Janine, for the introduction. And I would like to start also thanking the organizers and the program committee for the invitations to give the keynote lecture at the OHBM. It's really a great pleasure to be here today to give my talk. So in the talk today, I will use examples from the work I have done with clinical collaborators over the last years to illustrate how the combination of machine learning and neuroimage techniques can help us to address a number of clinical challenges in mental health and psychiatry, such as identifying biomarkers, improving diagnosis and prognosis of mental health disorders, and providing new tools for precision psychiatry. Well, mental health disorders are very common. They have an early onset. Most of the disorders start between the age of 14 and 24, and they can be very disabling, and unfortunately, there is often poor treatment outcome. And one of the big challenges in mental health in psychiatry is the lack of biomarkers. So different from many other medical areas, diagnosis in psychiatry is just based on symptoms and behaviors. And the problem with that is that many disorders have similar symptoms and behaviors, which makes the diagnosis very difficult. Furthermore, if we don't have a good understanding of the underlying neurobiology, it's difficult to develop new treatments. So there is clearly a need for developing new biomarkers, and these biomarkers have the potential to improve diagnosis and prognosis of mental health disorders and also enable early detection and early intervention. Neuroimage techniques have been around now for more than 30 years. They provide very detailed information about brain function, structure, and connectivity. Therefore, they hold really a huge potential as biomarkers for mental health disorders. But despite of many studies over the last approximately 30 years, there has been very limited clinical translation. So an obvious question for us to ask is, why haven't we found neuroimaging biomarkers yet? Well, I think there are many different reasons for that, but I would like to emphasize two challenges that I believe machine learning might help us to overcome. One challenge is the fact that when we talk about mental health disorders or psychiatry disorders, we are looking for very subtle and distributed changes in the brain. A situation that is very different from the most traditional neurological disorders, such as Parkinson and dementia, where we expect to see structural changes in the brain. So with mental health disorders, we expect to see changes much more subtle and distributed, and there is a lot of evidence that this difference might be at the connectivity level. So this is one challenge. The other challenge is the fact that over the last almost 30 years now, most of the clinical and psychiatric neuroimage studies have focused on group differences and not on individual prediction. So I would argue that in the search for neuroimage biomarkers, the question that we would like to answer is, how can we identify subtle patterns in neuroimage data used for psychiatry diagnosis? So if we replace the words neuroimage diagnosis, neuroimage data and psychiatry diagnosis, we can reframe this question as a much more general question, which is, how can we identify subtle patterns in complex data that is useful for prediction? And that's exactly one of the questions that machine learning tries to answer. The classical definition of machine learning is that it's a subfield of computer science that gives computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. So machine learning is considered a subfield of artificial intelligence, and machine learning algorithms build models based on trained data to perform decisions and predictions for new test data. And there are different types of learning in machine learning, and the most common ones are supervised learning and unsupervised learning. So in supervised learning, we give a training data consisting of patterns or examples and labels as input to a machine learning algorithm. And during the training, the algorithm will learn the relationship between the patterns and the labels. So the outcome of the training is a predictive function, which can then be used during the test phase to predict labels for new patterns or new examples. So in case of the unsupervised learning framework, we give unlabeled data as input to the machine learning algorithm. And the goal here is to identify some underlying structure in the data that can help us to perform tasks such as dimensionality reduction and clustering. Thank you. So in the example I'm showing here, this is a clustering task, and the aim would be to cluster the patterns into the different digits. One of the problems with clustering is that because it's a more unconstrained problem, there is often different ways to cluster a data, so the machine learning algorithm might not cluster the data as we'd like to, but might cluster data, for example, as between the bold numbers and the numbers not in bold. Or it might cluster the data between the numbers that are formed by straight lines versus the numbers that are formed by curved lines. And that is one of the big challenges when we use clustering algorithms, because there are often multiple possible solutions, and it's very difficult to choose which one is the optimal one for a specific problem. So in terms of applications, machine learning has been applied to many different areas, and among them neuroimaging data analysis. And in particular, the machine learning framework that has been mostly applied to psychiatric neuroimaging data has been the supervised classification framework. And in this framework, we give images and labels from 2 or more groups as input to the machine learning algorithm. During the training, the algorithm will learn discriminative patterns between these groups. So the output is again a predictive function which can be used during the testing phase to predict the labels for new test subjects. And this framework has 2 important advantages. One is the fact that it's a multivariate framework, so it does take into account subtle and distributed differences in the data. And the other one is that it enables single subject prediction. And over the last 15 years now, this framework has been applied to address a number of different clinical questions in psychiatry, such as diagnosing across disease, predicting disease outcome, identifying at-risk subjects, and identifying treatment responses. And in my opinion, all these studies over the last 15 years represent very strong evidence that there is predictive information in neuroimaging data. However, they have been also subject to criticism. And the main criticism has been in terms of reproducibility. So a number of reviews have shown that when the sample size increases, the accuracy of these models tend to decrease, which is a very counterintuitive result from a machine learning perspective, because usually most machine learning applications, when the sample size increases, the accuracy of the model also increases. So this figure from Gael Varacqua paper show meta-analysis uniting results for many different reviews. So each plot shows results for a different review, and each dot is a different study. And what we can see in one axis, we have reported accuracy, and in the other axis, we can see the study sample size. And we can see here that there is a general trend that when the sample size increases, the accuracy of the model tends to decrease. And there are different explanations for this trend. So one explanation is that the early studies had smaller sample size and tend to overfit, therefore they got higher accuracy. But another explanation for this trend is also that larger sample size are more heterogeneous, and therefore becomes more difficult to train the machine learning models. And after having used this classification framework in collaboration with clinicians for many years, I started to realize that there was an important limitation with this framework. And in my view, the main limitation with this framework is the fact that the clinical assessment that the clinician makes is very rich. But this information is summarized into a single label, which is the categorical classification. Usually, a binary decision, patient versus control. And the problem with that is that there is a lot of evidence that categoric classifications, diagnostic classifications in psychiatry are only reliable. They don't align with finds from neuroscience, genetics, and they have not able to predict treatment response. So when we use these categorical labels to train the machine learning model, so this is our model assumption, that the patients and the health controls come from two different distributions that are homogeneous and can be separated. But the real world is much more like that. So there is a lot of heterogeneity on the patient group and also on the health control group. So over the last years, my group has been developing and applying alternative machine learning frameworks to address relevant questions in mental health and psychiatry, but moving away from the categorical classification. And we can do that in different ways. So one way of doing that is using normative models. And normative models are very common in medical areas. So the idea is to fit a model to measures from the general or a healthy population in order to estimate normality range, which can then be used to identify individuals with abnormal measures that might have a disease or disorder, or might be at risk of developing a disease or disorder. So from a machine learning perspective, this problem can be framed as an outlier detection problem. So in this case, we train the machine learning algorithm with examples only from one class, usually consider the positive class. So in this example, I'm showing here with healthy controls, healthy individuals. So the output of the training is outlier detection function, which can then be used during the test phase to classify individuals as outliers or non-outliers with respect to the positive class, or in this case, the healthy individuals. So this framework has been already applied to address clinical questions in psychiatry, and one example is by identifying patients as outliers with respect to health controls. And I will now show an example of a study that we did now more than 10 years ago using this framework. So in this study, we test the hypothesis that we could treat the patient classification as an outlier detection problem. So in this study, we had fMRI data from a group of depressed patients and a group of health controls. And for each subject, we estimate an image summarizing their patterns of brain activations to SAD phase. We then train a machine learning algorithm called one-class support vector machine, which is an outlier detection algorithm with data only from health controls. And then we tested it with test health controls, not used for the training, and depressed patients. So when we apply it to the test data, we found that 79% of the healthy individuals were classified as non-outliers, but only about 50% of the patients were classified as outliers. So initially we thought, okay, these results are not very good because we are only detecting about half of the patients as outliers. But these patients had follow-up information. And when we look at this information, we found that some of them had responded to treatment and others not. So when we look at this information in more detail, we found that 70% of the patients that respond to treatment were classified as non-outliers, and 8-9% of the patients that did not respond to treatment were classified as outliers. So what the algorithm was telling us was that the real outliers were the patients that did not respond to treatment. So this was not the result that we expected initially, but we found was a very interesting result. What we also did was to correlate the outlier score with the depression score, and we found a very significant correlation, showing that the more depressed the subjects were, the more outlier they were. So this is, I think, one example of how we can use alternative frameworks, moving away from the categorical classification. So another way of doing that is using regression models, or which in psychiatry are also called the dimensional approach. And the idea here is that instead of training a classifier to predict the diagnostic category, we train a machine learning model to predict a continuous measure linked to a clinical symptoms or a behavior that might even cut across different categories. And this model is very aligned with ideas from the research domain criteria framework that is advocated by the National Institute of Mental Health in the US. So from a machine learning perspective, this can be considered a pattern regression model, and here we train the machine learning algorithm with images and continuous labels. So during the training, the algorithm will learn the relationship between these images and the labels again, and during the test, it can be used to predict now the continuous label for the test subjects. And this framework has also been applied to address clinical questions in psychiatry, such as predicting clinical symptoms from brain scans or predicting personality traits from brain scans. And I will now show one example of a proof of concept study that we did a few years ago to test the hypothesis that we could predict a common clinical symptom in a transdiagnostic sample. So in this study, we had fMRI data from a group of youth, and they had different diagnoses, and what they had in common was that all of them had some level of emotional and behavioral dysregulation. So here we estimated for each subject one image is summarizing the patterns of brain activations to reward, and we then trained pattern regression models to predict the measure that captured the behavioral and emotional dysregulations from the patterns of brain activations to reward. And we were able to predict the parent general behavioral inventory at 2 different time points, showing that it was possible to predict, common symptoms in a transdiagnostic sample. So one limitation of this study, which is a limitation that is common to many other machine learning applications, is that sometimes, even in the linear case, the models are difficult to interpret. So here on the right side, I'm showing the model weights, the predictive function, which show us the relative contributions of the different voxels for the prediction. But the difficulty here is to identify which were the regions more relevant for the prediction, because every voxel that has weight different from 0 has some contributions to the model prediction. And because this is a multivariate approach, we cannot arbitrarily threshold these maps. So part of the work we do in my group is to try to improve, to develop new approaches and strategies to improve the interpretability of the predictive model. So we don't use them as a black box for prediction. And one example is the work we did a couple of years ago, where we proposed an approach to improve the interpretability of whole brain predictive models by embedding anatomical and functional knowledge into the models. So here we start, this approach with whole brain patterns and labels. Sorry, I have a fly. I didn't expect that. Okay, so we start with whole brain patterns and labels. Then we use an atlas to segment the whole brain patterns into regional patterns, and we give the regional patterns together with the labels as input to a machine learning algorithm, which is called multiple kernel learning algorithm. So this algorithm is usually used to combine different sources of information for prediction, so we can learn the relative contributions of the different regions, as well as the contribution of the relative contributions of the different voxels within the regions for prediction. So the output of the training is a predictive function that tells us the relative importance, of the regions for prediction. And in this specific algorithm that we used, it has some sparsity assumptions, so it pushes some of the contributions of the regions' contributions to 0. So we are able to identify the regions that have the highest contributions to the model. And I'll now show an example of a clinical application of this approach in order to emphasize the benefits of using this type of approach. So in this study, we were interested in predict maniac symptoms, which is bipolar risk, from patterns of brain activations to reward. So it was also, in this study, we had an fMRI data, and for each subject, we estimate an image, summarize the patterns of brain activations to reward. We then trained the multiple kernel learning regression models to predict maniac symptoms from the patterns of brain activations to reward. So here on the left side, we can see a scatter plot between the predicted maniac symptoms and the actual maniac symptoms. So in order to emphasize the transdiagnostic aspect of the study, we color code the subject. So each dot represents a different subject, and we color code the subjects by diagnosis. And you can see that some subjects have one or more diagnoses, and other subjects don't have any diagnosis, the ones in gray. So we were able to predict, the maniac symptoms in this transdiagnostics sample. As I mentioned before, here we use the multiple channel learning regression, so we were also able to identify the regions that had highest contributions to the model prediction. And we identify, the left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex as the region that has had the highest contributions to the model. So what we then did was, in a second independent sample, we use only the patterns of brain activations to reward within this region. And we were able to confirm the importance of these regions for predicting maniac symptoms. So I think this is one example of how we can use this approach to identify, regions that are potential biomarkers for predicting symptoms related to mental health. So I think, in my opinion, these 3 clinical studies that I showed, they are good examples of how we can use alternative frameworks to address clinical challenges and interesting, relevant questions in mental health and psychiatry without having to rely on the categorical classification. But they also have limitations. In particular, they just use one modality of image data, and they are not really integrating all the information that is usually available for patients. So recently, a number of large databases that include neuroimaging data for more than 1,000 of subjects became available. And this database, they really open, I think, huge opportunity to advance population neuroscience and mental health, but they also bring challenges, which is how can we combine all this information into the models. Usually these databases, they have multiple modalities of imaging, genetic, demographic, environmental information, and all these different sources of information are high dimensional. So the question is how we can combine all this information into the models in order to answer relevant research questions. So my group, over the last years, has been focused on how we can combine, multiple sources of particularly high-dimensional information into the models. And one way of doing that is by building multiple source models for diagnosis and prognosis. They can also be called multimodal models or data fusion models. So, and the idea here is to combine multiple sources of information. So here in this example, we have multiple modalities of images, but can be also no images information together, as input to a machine learning algorithm. And these models can also be extended to predict more than one clinical score at the same time, using what in machine learning is called multi-output prediction. And the advantage of doing that is that there is evidence that is more advantageous to predict correlated scores together than predicting them individually. And so this framework, it fits into the supervised framework I've shown before. It's just an extension of this framework. And it can be very helpful for identifying, biomarkers, because we can use this framework to learn the relative contributions of the different sources of information for prediction. However, in order to use this framework, we need to have labeled data, labeled training data. And for many clinical challenges in psychiatry and mental health, unfortunately, we still don't have labeled training data, for example, for identifying subtypes of patients or for identifying subjects at risk of developing mental health disorders. So another potential way of combining multiple sources of information is building multiple source models for stratification. And the idea here is similar. We combine the multiple sources of information as input to a machine learning algorithm. But the goal now is to find some common patterns across these different sources that might enable us to identify different subgroups of subjects, different subtypes of subjects. And the assumption here is that these subgroups of subjects might correspond to more homogeneous subtypes of patients, and therefore might be better target for a specific treatment and intervention. And from a machine learning perspective, we can see that this fits into a clustering problem. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, the problem with the clustering is that it's a very difficult problem to solve because there are often many possible solutions. So if we try to give all these multiple sources of information as input to a machine learning algorithm, it's very unlikely that we'll find meaningful clusters because all this information, these different sources are very high dimensional. So we need to find ways of simplifying this problem. And there are different ways of doing that. So in my group, we are trying to simplify these problems by using approaches that can find latent dimensions of associations across these different sources. So in order to simplify this problem, we are trying to answer the following question. So can we use latent dimensions of cross-modality association as a parsimonious way to characterize variations in mental health? So if we focus only on two modalities, brain and behavior, we can simplify these questions to, can we use latent dimensions of brain behavior associations as a parsimonious way to characterize variations in mental health? And in the next couple of slides, I will try to give some intuition behind this idea. So the idea here is that if we have brain data and behavioral data from very large samples, we can identify brain changes that happen together with behavioral changes, changes that covary. So for example, in this toy, we have a toy example here where we have a network with only two regions, and we see that when these networks vary across the sample, we have from red to blue, and we can think of this variation as being gray matter density or connectivity or activity variation. What we observe across our sample is that when this network varies, the brain network varies, we also observe behavior variation that goes from, for example, I thought there was nothing good for me in life until the behavior, I have been feeling optimistic about the future. So this pattern of brain behavior covariation defines latent dimensions of brain behavior association. And once we find this latent dimension, what we can do is that we can compute brain scores for each subject in our sample and also behavior scores for each subject in our sample. And what these scores tell us is how much each subject in the sample expressed this association. So what we can then do, because by construction, the brain and behavior scores are correlated, we can average them to create a brain behavior score, which in this case is related to depression. And we can find more than one latent dimension of brain behavior association. So in the second toy example, we have a different brain network that is covering with different set of behavior. For example, here we have this different network that covaries with the behaviors that go from I attach little importance to have close friends until I had the best family in the world. So we can see that this latent dimension is capturing more social aspect. So again, once we found this latent dimension, we can compute scores, brain scores for each subject in our sample, and behavior scores for each subject in our sample, and you can average them to create a brain behavior score, which now is related to social aspects. So once we find these latent dimensions, what we can do is that we can combine them to create a brain behavior latent space. And because we are able to compute the scores on these latent dimensions for each subject in our sample, we can plot our sample in this latent space. And you can use this space to, for example, for identifying subtypes of subjects, subgroups of subjects, based on their scores on the latent dimensions. And because here, we have one latent dimension that is related to depression, we can use this space to identify subjects that have depression. And because we have more than one latent dimension, we could, for example, this is a toy example, but we could use the second latent dimension to identify two subgroups of depression. For example, one that have social problems and the other that doesn't have social problem. We can also use this approach, this framework to identify subjects that are at risk of developing mental health disorders if they have relative high scores in specific dimensions. So the question now is how we identify these latent dimensions of brain behavior association. Well, we can do that by using multivariate approaches such as the sparse partially square or Kernel regularized canonical correlation analysis, among others. And here the sparse partially square and the Kernel canonical correlation analysis are extensions of the traditional CCA and PLS that can work with very high dimensional data. So the way these approaches work is that they find pairs of weights, one for each data, brain's weights and behavior weights, such that they maximize the association between the latent variables. So they capture the latent dimension of association. So once we find these weights, what we can do is that we project the brain data onto the brain weights to compute brain scores, and we do the same with the behavioral data to compute behavior scores, and then we can combine the brain and behavior scores to see how this association varies across the sample. And I now show an example of a study we did a few years ago where we used this approach to identify latent dimensions of brain behavior association in a sample of adolescents and young adults. So the sample we used in this study was provided by the Neuroscience and Psychiatry network and consisted of about 330 subjects and between the age of 14 and 24, and 10% of the sample had depression. So here we use the sparse partial square to identify latent dimensions of brain behavior associations between voxel-wise gray matter features and items from 16 different questionnaires that captured positive and negative aspects of mental health. We also include 3 demographic variables together with the behavioral variables, which were sex, gender, and poverty index. So we were able to, using this approach, we were able to identify 2 latent dimensions of brain behavior association. The first one captured an associations between age and drink habits, and a network that include frontotemporal parietal and associative cortical regions. And here on the bottom, we can see the latent space color-coded by age, so we can really see that this latent dimension is capturing a developmental aspect of the sample, which is also was related to drink habits. And we also found a second latent dimension of association in the sample, which was related to depression. So we captured associations between depression and self-harm items, and a network that included hippocampus, parahippocampus gyrus, and limbic regions. And here on the bottom, we can see the latent space now color-coded by diagnosis, and we can see that this latent dimension is capturing a psychopathological aspect of the sample. So this study for us was an important demonstration that we could use this approach to identify latent dimensions of brain behavior associations in adolescents that are linked to developmental and psychopathological aspects of the sample. But this study has one important limitation. So the sample size is relatively small, and only 10% of the subjects had depression. So if we are interested in identifying key latent dimensions of brain behavior associations in adolescents that are related to mental health, we need to apply these approaches to much larger samples. So recently, we set up a study to answer the following question, can we identify latent dimensions of brain psychosocial associations in large populations of healthy adolescents? And here I'm using psychosocial instead of behavior because we include more than just behavior in the model. We also included clinical, cognitive, and sociodemographic information. So in order to answer this question, we used the sample from the ABCD study. So I think most of you might be familiar with. I will give just a very brief introduction. So the ABCD study is the largest long-term study of brain development and child health in the United States. It recruited more than 11,000 of children around the age of 9 and 10 years old across 22 sites, and they will be followed up for at least 10 years. So in our study, we use the baseline data. So after cleaning the data and removing subjects that had missing variables, our sample consisted of 11,288 children. And as brain data, we used voxel-wise gray matter features. And as psychosocial data, we used items from 29 assessments that evaluated mental health, cognitive performance, behavior domains, and social demographics. And our main question in this study was, how many brain psychosocial latent dimensions can we find in the ABCD data set? And are any of them specific to psychopathology? So recent multivariate analysis of structural ABCD data have found between 3 and 5 latent dimensions, but they were not specific to psychopathology. And these studies differed from our study in many aspects, from the methodological approach to the variables that they used. So now I will show the results for this study. So using the sparse partial square, we were able to identify 6 latent dimensions of brain psychosocial association in the ABCD data. And the first latent dimension captured an association between IQ and income and a network that included attentional executive regions. So the second latent dimension captured an associations between abnormal eating behaviors and a network that include visual and limbic regions. So the third latent dimension captured an associations between Hispanic background and language aspects related to being bilingual, and a network that included language and executive regions. So the fourth latent dimension captured an association between ADHD symptoms and a network that included the caudate nucleus and dopaminergic regions. So the fifth latent dimension captured an association between self-control and mood, and a network that includes limbic and default mode regions. And the last one, the final, the sixth dimension, captured an association between IQ, with fluid and crystallized IQ being at different ends of the dimension, and a network that included cingulate, dopaminergic, and cerebellar regions. And as we can see here, 3 out of these 6 latent dimensions were related to mental health, and they raise a very interesting point about the difference of combining brain with symptoms and behavior in order to find latent dimensions related to mental health. So when latent dimension models, such as factor analysis, are just applied to symptoms and behavior, for example, ADHD symptoms tend to be incorporated into an externalizing factor together with OCD and externalizing symptoms, rather than appearing as 2 different dimensions here, which happens when we include the brain into the analysis. We have dimension 4 and 5 here. Another example is that abnormal eating behaviors tend to be incorporated into an internalizing factor together with other internalizing symptoms, rather than appearing as a different entity as in mode 2 here. So this study demonstrates that by using this approach to combine brain with other symptoms and behavior information, we can identify new latent dimensions related to mental health, which are also linked to an underlying neurobiology. So I want to finish giving a vision of what I expect that we can achieve with this type of approach. So my vision is that if we apply this approach to much larger samples with potentially different types of mental health patients, so I expect us to be able to identify multiple latent dimensions related to mental health. And we can combine these latent dimensions to create a mental health space. And I expect that there will be an area in the space where healthy subjects will lie, represented by the subjects in blue here. And every subject will have scores in these latent dimensions. And if a subject has scores very high in one or more of these latent mental health related dimensions, so this might characterize a mental health disorder. So this latent space represents a parsimonious way of combining multiple sources of information and can help us potentially to identify subtypes of patients as well as subjects at risk of developing mental health disorders. So I want to also finish saying that we try to make all the models we develop available through open source software. We have made released Pronto many years ago now with a number of supervised learning models that I mentioned in the talk. And more recently, we released the CCA-PLS toolkit, which includes a number of approaches to identify multivariate associations between multiple modalities such as brain and behavior. Of course, I want to finish acknowledging, current and former members of my group who do and support all this work, and my colleagues and collaborators. And I'm really happy to answer questions.
Thank you. So we'll just go through questions online, and if certainly people want to ask it, then just step up to the microphone. So one of them is, how do we find better diagnostic markers if the main way to test prediction is against DSM, which itself has flaws?
Sorry, I couldn't hear the question very well.
Okay, sorry. How do we find better markers, diagnostic markers, if the best way we have to test the prediction is against DSM diagnoses?
It's a very good question. Yeah, I think we probably, in order to find new biomarkers, I don't think necessarily can go back to the labels to confirm if we believe that there are problems with the labels because they are not neurobiological grounded or they don't have an underlying neurobiology, so we probably need to find other ways to validate these biomarkers, such as treatment response. We have other metrics to validate them, not with respect to the current categories that we know have problems.
Thank you. I think one of the other questions is more of a follow-up question almost, which is considering the huge heterogeneity in psychiatric diagnostic labels, do you think there's, the question is supervised machine learning reasonable? So if the labels are challenging to begin with?
I think it depends on the research question, because I think you can use I will just give an example. We use a lot of supervised models now, but to build models from a transdiagnostic perspective, so we try to predict symptoms that cut across different diagnoses, so continuous symptoms. So I think this is a very good way to go around having to rely on the categorical labels, but still train the models. That would be an example.
Here's another one. What are the most important confounders in prediction? Oh, it just moved. Oh, wait. What are the most important confounders that you should be thinking about when doing prediction?
Many. I can just give I think that's a very important question, and it's a really important point for us to reflect if we want to take this to the clinic, because there are the usual confounds. You can think of age, gender. Then we have to think, are they confounds or are they part of the phenomenon? Because maybe some disorders might be more common in females than males, so maybe they are not a confound, they are part of the phenomenon. But we are training these models with very specific samples, maybe white European or white, and they might not be reflecting a more general diverse sample. So I think there are many of them. We should really be discussing that, because I think there are the common confounds, site, age, gender, but I think there are many other confounds, socioeconomic stats, and many other things that we are probably not thinking about, but they are in the model. So we'll have, I think, no matter what we do, we will have it. One way to get around is to use extremely large samples, because somehow this is moved out to this effect through the sample. But we have to know the characteristics, to be aware of the characteristic of the sample, because if the sample has any bias, the model will just reproduce the same bias.
Thank you. The next question is, how much predictive power is needed for MRI biomarkers to reach the cost effectiveness of computer-based tasks or questionnaires? What is the value or the predictive power?
The predictive power.
Yes.
I think in order to replace all the tasks, that's a very, very good question. I think if you're just using fMRI to replace a task, it's probably not going to be cost effective, but hopefully fMRI will help us to learn something new about the disorders, or to find subtypes, or to find new latent dimensions, the brain data. I don't think we should be using neuroimage to replace, other types of more cheap tests that we can do. Hopefully we can use it to discover new things.
Maybe we'll do just one last question. And so we've heard a lot about replicability and generalizability. It's very important. We're talking about it a lot at this meeting. Can you give an example of a model that you think is showing good replicability and generalizability in new cohorts?
A model that has shown good reproducibility.
And generalizability.
Generalizability. I think the best models that we can see in these areas is when we have these challenges. This is one example, although the challenge also is within a certain sample, a certain study. But I think one way to make sure these results are reproducible, generalizable, is when different people try different things and they can still predict an out-of-sample data. But it still is usually the challenges within one sample. So what we really need to be looking at is for models that are trained at, I would say, in 3 studies and then being applied to 3 other studies that have different characteristics. So once we reach there, then I think we have potential for a clinical translation. Until we are there, I think we will be limited.
Okay, then I want to thank everyone for coming, and let's thank Janaina for an excellent talk.